Have you ever been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you? I have, and for years I thought they won, until the day karma came knocking at their door. Welcome to AGS Stories, where true stories of betrayal, resilience, and justice come to life. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into today's powerful story. I was 12 when my father died in a car accident. One moment, I had a dad who loved me, who told me I could be anything I wanted to be. The next, I was standing in the doorway, watching my mother collapse onto the floor, screaming as the police officer delivered the news. That moment is burned into my memory. The flashing red and blue lights, the suffocating silence after the officer left, the way my mother sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at nothing. At 12, I didn't understand grief, not really. I just knew my world had changed forever. For a while, it was just the two of us, my mother and me, navigating the wreckage of our old life. She was distant, lost in her own sadness, but we managed. We survived. At least that's what I thought. Then a year later, she met Ron. Within 6 months, they were married and everything changed. Ron wasn't just another man. He came with baggage, his 2 sons, Tyler and Jake, who were 14 and 16 at the time. They weren't just my stepbrothers. They were my tormentors. From the moment they moved in, I was the outsider, the maid, the invisible girl who only existed to cook, clean, and make their lives easier. If I ever protested, Ron would smirk and say, "Be grateful you even have a roof over your head. Do you know how much it costs to keep you?" At first, I thought my mother would defend me. She didn't. She looked away. Every single time. I became an expert at silence, at staying out of their way, at swallowing the anger that built inside me. I poured everything into my studies because that was my only escape. College became my light at the end of the tunnel, my way out of that house, that life. My father had always said education was the key to everything, and I clung to that belief with everything I had. But life had other plans. One night, just a year before I was supposed to graduate high school, my mother and Ron called a family meeting. I remember sitting at the dining table while Tyler and Jake scrolled through their phones, barely listening. Ron leaned back in his chair and said casually, "We've sold the house. We're moving to Arizona next month." Just like that. No discussion. No warning. The house where I had grown up, the house that still held memories of my father, was gone, and I had no say in the matter. That night, I locked myself in my room and cried until I couldn't breathe. I held onto the last picture I had of my dad, the two of us smiling at my 10th birthday party, and I wondered how I had ended up here. How had my life turned into something so unrecognizable? The move happened quickly, too quickly. Before I knew it, I was in a new city, a new school, a new life where I was even more alone than before. Tyler and Jake fit in effortlessly, making friends the first week. I spent my lunch breaks alone in the library, drowning in textbooks, trying to pretend I didn't care. I told myself it was temporary, just one more year, then I'd be free. When my 18th birthday arrived, I was ready. I had researched colleges, prepped applications, and kept my grades near perfect. That night, I approached my mother in the kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest, but I steadied my voice. "Mom, I need to talk to you about college," I said. She didn't even look up from her phone. "There's no money for college, Emma." I froze. But Dad had savings. He was saving for my education. Her expression hardened. "We used it. You think living here is free? Do you think food appears by magic? Ron has spent so much on you already." I barely registered Ron entering the room, the smug look on his face making my stomach turn. "And now that you're 18, he said, "it's time you start paying your way. Starting next month, you owe rent." I dropped the plate I was holding. The crash echoed through the kitchen, but I barely heard it. Rent? My own mother was making me pay to live in the house I had been raised in? I pushed back from the counter, my voice shaking. "I'd rather be anywhere else than give you a single dime." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "And where exactly would you go, Emma? You have no family, no friends, no money. Face reality. You have nowhere to go." She was right. I had nothing. So I did the only thing I could. I agreed to their terms. The next morning, I started looking for a job. Within a week, I was working at a small cafe, scrubbing tables and pouring coffee for customers who didn't even see me. My first paycheck felt like an insult, barely enough to cover the rent Ron and my mother demanded. When I handed over the money, Ron counted it in front of me, shaking his head. "This is it," he scoffed. "You need to pick up more shifts." And just like that, my life turned into a cycle of exhaustion. Wake up, work at the cafe, go to my second job at a diner, get home after midnight, sleep for a few hours. Repeat. I was trapped, stuck in a life that wasn't mine, paying for a family that didn't love me. And I thought that was how my story would end, until one day, a stranger walked into the cafe and changed everything. I learned at a young age that family isn't always the people who share your blood. It's the people who stand beside you when life gets unbearable. And the people who should have been my family, they were the ones who made my life a living nightmare. After my father died, my mother became a ghost of herself. She drifted through the days in a haze of grief, barely speaking, barely eating. I tried to hold on to her, to remind her that I was still here, that I still needed her. But it was like she had buried a part of herself along with my father. For 2 years, it was just the two of us, existing more than living, bound together by silence and loss. Then she met Ron. Ron was loud, brash, and overconfident, the kind of man who entered a room and expected everyone to fall in line. And my mother? She did. Within 6 months, they were married, and suddenly my life, my home, was no longer mine. Along with Ron came his 2 sons, Tyler and Jake. From the moment they stepped through our front door, I knew I was nothing more than an inconvenience in their new family. I tried in the beginning. I really did. I wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could be a real family. But it became clear very quickly that there was no place for me in this house. While Tyler and Jake got the larger bedrooms, I was shoved into the smallest one. While they lounged on the couch, playing video games for hours, I was the one cleaning up after them. And when I finally worked up the courage to complain, Ron just smirked at me. "This is a man's house," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should be grateful you even have a roof over your head." My mother didn't say a word. That was the moment I realized I was completely alone. I became the maid, the cook, the forgotten stepchild, while my mother built a new life with her new family. I scrubbed floors while Tyler and Jake laughed in the background. I made dinner while my mother set plates in front of them with a warm smile that I hadn't seen in years. I did everything I could to make myself seen, to prove that I still belonged. But I never did. Boys will be boys. My mother would say when I told her how Tyler and Jake mocked me, how they tossed my clothes onto the front lawn just to watch me scramble to collect them before the neighbors saw. Boys will be boys, she said when they locked me out of the house in the middle of winter, laughing as I banged on the door, my fingers turning numb from the cold. And when I finally stopped trying, when I retreated into silence, into my studies, into the only thing that I could control, no one noticed. I held on to one thing: college. It was my escape plan, my one shot at leaving this house and never looking back. My father had always told me that education was the key to everything, and I believed him. I threw myself into my studies, acing every exam, pushing myself to exhaustion because I knew that once I had that acceptance letter in my hands, I would finally be free. But life had one final betrayal waiting for me. I had spent months preparing. I had a list of colleges, application fees saved up from the little money I made babysitting for the neighbors. My grades were perfect. My future was set. Then, on the night of my 18th birthday, I went to my mother with my plans. "College," she said, barely looking up from her phone. "Emma, there's no money for college." I froze. But Dad had savings. He was putting money aside for my education. She sighed, rubbing her temples as if I was just another problem she had to deal with. "We had to use that money, Emma. Do you think living here is free? Do you think food magically appears on the table? Ron has spent so much on you already." Ron walked into the kitchen at that exact moment, grinning like this was all some inside joke that I wasn't in on. "And now that you're 18, he added, "it's time to pay your way. Rent is due next month." I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Rent? My own mother was making me pay to live in the house I had grown up in? I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "You're joking." Ron chuckled. Welcome to the real world, sweetheart. I turned to my mother, waiting, praying that she would stop this, that she would finally stand up for me. She didn't. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling numb. Every sacrifice, every late night spent studying, every moment I had held on to the belief that my father's wishes, his dreams for me, still mattered. It was all a lie. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I had nowhere to go. The next morning, I swallowed my pride and started looking for a job. Within a week, I was working as a waitress at a local cafe. The shifts were long. My feet ached constantly, and customers rarely even looked at me when they placed their orders. But none of that mattered. I just needed to survive. My first paycheck was humiliatingly small, barely enough to cover the rent that Ron and my mother demanded. When I handed the cash over at the end of the week, Ron counted it in front of me, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "This is it," he scoffed. "You need to pick up more shifts." And just like that, I was working 2 jobs. Days at the cafe, nights at a diner across town. My hands were constantly sore, my body ached in ways I didn't even know were possible, and my grades, my one lifeline, started slipping. And while I worked myself to the bone, Tyler and Jake lived their best lives. They partied. They went on vacations. They drove brand new cars while I could barely afford bus fare. One night, I came home from a double shift to find my work uniform drenched in cologne, a note taped to the front. "Now you don't smell like fries. You're welcome. Love, your brothers." I stood there, holding the ruined fabric in my hands, shaking with exhaustion and rage. And my mother? She just sighed, barely glancing up from her wine glass. "You really should have a sense of humor, Emma." That was my breaking point. I had spent my entire life begging for love from a woman who was incapable of giving it. I had let myself believe, over and over again, that if I just worked hard enough, if I was just good enough, she would finally see me. But she never would. That night, I made a decision. I was done being their servant, done being their punching bag. I was going to find a way out of this hell. And I had no idea that the key to my freedom would come from the most unexpected place. Comment 111 if you want me to do something for the traitors. Comment 222 if you want me to forgive them. The realization hit me like a freight train. My father had left me $500,000, money that was supposed to secure my future, to give me the chance to build a life beyond the prison of this house. And yet, here I was exhausted beyond belief, working 2 dead-end jobs just to hand over my paycheck to the very people who had stolen it from me. I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. The way my mother had barely looked at me when she dismissed my question, as if my future wasn't even worth a second thought. "There's no money. We had to use it to support you." Support me? That was the biggest lie I had ever heard. They hadn't used that money for me. They had used it for themselves, lavish vacations, expensive clothes, luxury cars. I had spent years suffering in silence while they lived like kings on what was supposed to be my inheritance. I had sacrificed everything, my childhood, my happiness, my dreams, all for them to turn around and steal the one thing my father had left me. And Ron? The way he smirked, leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms crossed, made my blood boil. "Now that you're 18, it's time to pay rent. Welcome to the real world, sweetheart." The real world? He had no idea what the real world was. He had never worked a single honest day in his life. Yet here he was, demanding that I hand over what little I earned to support his lazy, selfish existence. I felt something shift inside me that night. The last piece of whatever love I had for my mother withered away, leaving behind nothing but a hollow pit of anger and determination. They had taken everything from me. Now it was my turn. I spent the next few months carefully planning my revenge. Every spare second I had between shifts was dedicated to researching my legal options. If my father had truly set aside that money for me, there had to be records of it somewhere. And if there were records, there had to be a way to get it back. The only person I could trust was my grandmother, my father's mother, the one person who had always loved me, but had been kept away from me by my mother and Ron. It had been years since I had spoken to her, but I knew that if there was anyone who would fight for me, it was her. I reached out to her through an old email I had memorized years ago. I didn't expect an answer right away, but to my surprise, she responded within hours. Emma, sweetheart, I've been trying to find you for years. Call me as soon as you can. There's something I need to tell you. I called her that night, hands shaking as I clutched my cheap, secondhand phone. The moment I heard her voice, something inside me cracked. She knew. She had known all along. Emma, your father left you a trust fund, she told me. $500,000. It was meant for your education or whatever future you wanted to build. But after he passed, your mother, she withdrew everything. I nearly dropped the phone. She took all of it. My voice was barely above a whisper. Every penny, my grandmother confirmed, her voice tight with anger. She and Ron went to the bank the very day of your father's accident. Before they even went to the hospital, before they even told me he was gone, they were at the bank, emptying his accounts. The betrayal burned through me like acid. I had thought I knew the depths of my mother's selfishness. But this was beyond anything I had ever imagined. They had stolen from a dying man, from his own daughter, and I had spent years suffering because of it. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind was racing with possibilities, with the knowledge that there was a way out of this. My grandmother had already contacted a lawyer. There was a case to be made, a way to take back what was rightfully mine. But the legal route would take time. And in the meantime, I had another plan. I started acting differently. I stopped fighting back when Ron mocked me. I started handing over my money without complaint, even throwing in a fake smile every now and then. I let my mother believe she had won, that I had finally accepted my place in their household. Meanwhile, I was gathering every bit of information I could. I searched through old paperwork when no one was home, scanning bank statements and receipts. I took pictures of everything, proof of the lavish vacations, the brand new cars, the expensive shopping sprees. I knew the legal battle would need more than just my word, and I was determined to build an airtight case. And then I waited. I waited for the moment when they least expected it, when Ron and my mother were at their most comfortable, drunk on the illusion that they had complete control over me. Then I struck. One evening, after another grueling double shift, I walked into the house with a purpose. My mother was on the couch, sipping wine, her latest designer handbag sitting on the coffee table beside her. Ron was watching TV, feet propped up, acting like he owned the place. I stepped in front of the screen. "We need to talk." Ron scoffed. "Unless it's about your rent. I don't want to hear it." I smiled, pulling out my phone. "Oh, I think you want to hear this." I pressed play on the voice recording I had taken earlier that week. Ron, in all his arrogance, bragging about how they had used my father's money to fund their lifestyle. My mother's face drained of color. What is that?" she stammered. "Proof," I said calmly. "Proof that you stole from me. Proof that you took $500,000 that was never yours to begin with. And guess what? Grandma has a lawyer. She has bank records. And now, she has this recording too." Ron jumped to his feet, his face twisted in rage. "You ungrateful little..." "Careful." I cut him off, voice icy. "Say one more word, and this goes straight to the police. Fraud, theft, financial abuse. I'm sure they'd love to hear all about it." My mother's hands were shaking. "Emma, we can fix this. We'll take out a loan." I laughed. "Oh, don't worry. You'll be giving me back every penny. Not because you want to, because you have no choice." They were trapped, and they knew it. I had won. Within a month, the legal process was underway. My mother and Ron had no way out. They had to return the money, every last cent. My grandmother's lawyer made sure of that. But that wasn't even the best part. With the evidence I had collected, authorities started digging into their finances. And guess what? Turns out they had more than just my stolen inheritance to answer for. Tax fraud, money laundering, the list went on. The last time I saw them, they were being led out of the house in handcuffs. Tyler and Jake? They weren't any better off. Without their parents' stolen money, they spiraled quickly, partying, drugs, arrests. The perfect family they had built off my suffering came crashing down around them. And me? I walked away with my head held high. I used the money to start my own business, just like my father would have wanted. I built a life that was mine, free from the people who had tried to keep me trapped. I never looked back. But I'll tell you this, karma always catches up. If you agree with my plan, comment 111. If you have another idea, tell me in the comments. There's a special kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you work two jobs just to survive. A kind of weariness that no amount of sleep can cure. It wasn't just the physical toll, the aching feet, the sore muscles, the burns from scalding dishwater. It was the knowledge that all of it was pointless. Every hour I spent working wasn't for me. It was for them. Every paycheck I brought home went straight into Ron's greedy hands. And every time I handed over that money, he counted it in front of me, always finding something to criticize. "This is it," he scoffed, flipping through the bills like they were worthless scraps. "You need to pick up more shifts, Emma. You're barely covering your share." My share, as if I was some stranger renting a room in their home, as if I wasn't their daughter, their family. But I wasn't. Not to them. They saw me as nothing more than a walking wallet, a servant who was useful only as long as I could keep working. And if I ever showed the slightest bit of resistance, Ron was quick to remind me how easily I could be replaced. "You think you can just leave?" he sneered one night when I dared to push back. "Go ahead. See how long you last out there on your own. You don't have a dime to your name, and no one's coming to save you. You'll come crawling back in a week." I clenched my fists, biting back the words that threatened to spill from my lips. He was wrong. I wasn't coming back. I was going to survive. And one day, they would regret everything they had done to me. My days blurred into an endless cycle of exhaustion. I woke up before dawn to make breakfast for a family that never thanked me, then rushed to my first job at a small cafe downtown. The work was grueling. Long hours on my feet, rude customers who barely acknowledged my existence, endless coffee refills that left my hands raw and stained. Then, as soon as my shift ended, I ran across town to my second job at a cheap diner, where I spent the night scrubbing plates and sweeping floors until my body ached. I got home well past midnight, collapsed in a bed for a few hours, and did it all over again the next day. While I worked myself into the ground, Tyler and Jake lived in luxury. They had everything: brand new clothes, the latest gaming consoles, weekends spent partying with their friends. And they never let me forget it. "Hey, Burger Girl," Tyler sneered one evening as I walked in the door, my uniform still stained with grease from my shift. "Maybe you can wash our socks next?" Jake laughed, tossing his sneakers toward me. "Yeah, since you're already cleaning up after everyone, might as well make yourself useful." I ignored them, keeping my head down, but the anger simmered beneath my skin. Then, one day, I found my work uniform soaking in an overwhelming cloud of cologne, a note taped to the front. "Now you don't smell like fries." "You're welcome. Love, your brothers." I stared at the ruined fabric, my hands trembling. I had spent my last few dollars washing the uniform, making sure it was clean for my next shift. And now, I had nothing to wear. When I confronted my mother, she barely looked up from her phone. "You really should have a sense of humor, Emma," she sighed. A sense of humor. They had stolen my father's money. They had turned me into their servant. They had taken everything from me. And now, they wanted me to laugh about it? I walked away before I said something I couldn't take back. Because I knew if I let myself go, if I let myself feel the full weight of my anger, I wouldn't be able to stop. The day they left for Hawaii was the day I officially lost what little hope I had left. I had come home from a grueling double shift, every inch of my body screaming for rest, only to find the house completely empty. At first, I thought they had gone out for the evening. Then I saw the note on the fridge. "Gone to Hawaii for 2 weeks. Try not to burn the house down while we're gone." I gripped the counter, my vision blurring. They were on vacation. While I scrubbed plates until my fingers bled, they sipped cocktails on the beach. With my money. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear that note into pieces, to throw every single thing in that house onto the floor and watch it shatter. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there in the silent, empty kitchen, my whole body shaking. And for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to truly hate them. I had spent years convincing myself that maybe, deep down, my mother still loved me. That maybe there was some part of her that felt guilty for what she had done. But I was done lying to myself. She had made her choice. And now, I was going to make mine. I spent those 2 weeks carefully preparing. With no one in the house to watch me, I had free rein to search for the evidence I needed. I combed through bank statements, receipts, old documents, anything that could prove that they had stolen my inheritance. And when I finally pieced it all together, my stomach turned. The money wasn't just gone. They had spent it recklessly. Thousands of dollars wasted on gambling, designer clothes, first-class vacations. And worst of all, there were transactions tied to something even darker. Drugs. They weren't just living off my father's money. They were funding an addiction. I felt sick, but at the same time, I felt something else. Power. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the helpless girl they had beaten down. I wasn't their servant, their victim. I was the one in control. When they came back from their vacation, I was waiting. I had already contacted my grandmother. Her lawyer was ready. The case against them was airtight. I sat calmly at the dining table as they waltzed through the door, sun-kissed and laughing, their luggage still in their hands. Ron smirked when he saw me. "Miss us?" I slid a stack of printed documents across the table. "No, but you're going to miss your freedom." My mother's face drained of color as she flipped through the pages. Bank statements, fraudulent transactions, drug deals traced back to Ron. "You," she whispered, her hands shaking. "You've been spying on us?" "No," I said, standing up. "I've been surviving. But now I'm done." Ron lunged for the papers, but it was too late. At that exact moment, the door burst open. Police officers flooded the room, their voices sharp and commanding. My mother screamed as they pulled her hands behind her back. Ron cursed, thrashing against the officers as they shoved him against the wall. Tyler and Jake? They just stood there, frozen in shock. I watched it all with a strange sense of calm. For years, they had made me feel powerless. But now, they were the ones trapped. Ron and my mother were both charged with fraud and drug-related crimes. They lost everything, their home, their money, their freedom. Tyler and Jake, without their parents to bail them out, quickly spiraled. Within months, they were arrested for drug possession, following in their father's footsteps. And me? I walked away with my head held high. With the money rightfully returned to me, I finally had the chance to build the life I had always dreamed of. I moved out. I started my own business. I reclaimed my future. And I never looked back. Because in the end, karma always wins. Tell me, do you think they got what they deserved? Comment 111 if you think they deserved it. Or even worse. Or let me know what you would have done. The day everything changed started out like any other. I had been up since dawn, dragging myself through another double shift at the cafe, running on caffeine and sheer determination. The exhaustion was constant now, a permanent weight on my shoulders, but I had learned to live with it. Because what choice did I have? It was a slow afternoon when she walked in. At first, I barely noticed her. Just another customer, an older woman with kind eyes, sitting alone in the corner booth. But then, she said my name, Emma. I turned, nearly dropping the coffee pot in my hands. There was something familiar about her, something that tugged at the edges of a memory I had long buried. And then it hit me. "B, Grandma." My voice barely came out as a whisper. Her eyes filled with tears as she stood, reaching for me. "Oh, sweetheart." I froze. It had been years since I had last seen my grandmother, my father's mother, the one person who had loved me before she was erased from my life. I had been too young to understand why, but now I knew. My mother had kept her away. Margaret pulled me into a hug, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt warmth. Not the forced, fake smiles my mother used to manipulate people, not the suffocating presence of Ron's control, just genuine, unconditional love. She held on to me tightly, as if she were afraid I would disappear. And when she finally pulled back, her expression shifted from relief to something darker. "Emma," she said softly, "why are you here? Why are you working like this?" I let out a hollow laugh. "Because I don't have a choice." Her brows furrowed. "But, sweetheart, your father left you $500,000. Everything inside me stilled." "What?" She looked at me like I had just said something insane. "The trust fund. Your father set up a trust for you, Emma. $500,000. It was meant for your education, for your future. You were supposed to have access to it when you turn 18. My hands started shaking. I couldn't breathe. $500,000. The money my father had left to protect me, to give me the life I deserved. And my mother, she had stolen it. I gripped the edge of the counter. my nails digging into the wood as realization slammed into me like a freight train. While I was working double shifts, they were blowing my inheritance on their pathetic little fantasy life. The luxury vacations, the brand new cars, the endless shopping sprees. Every single dollar had come from the trust fund my father had left for me. I felt sick. Emma, my grandmother's voice was gentle, but I could hear the underlying fury beneath it. Did your mother? Did she tell you the money was gone? I swallowed hard, nodding. She said there was never any money, that they had to use it to support me. The words tasted like poison in my mouth. Margaret's face darkened, her jaw tightening. She lied. Of course she did. I had known my mother was selfish, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. Ron had always acted like he owned me, like I owed him for the life he had so graciously provided. And all this time, he had been spending my money. The rage that simmered inside me threatened to boil over. Margaret placed a gentle hand over mine. Sweetheart, you need to come with me. There's something you need to see. I didn't hesitate. We left the cafe together, my apron still tied around my waist, my heart pounding in my chest. I barely registered the drive to my grandmother's lawyer's office, my mind racing with the horrifying truth. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Caldwell, greeted us with a firm handshake and a folder, one filled with proof. Bank statements, legal documents, paperwork that detailed exactly how my father had set up the trust fund in my name. And then the withdrawals. The signature at the bottom of the paperwork that drained the account completely, my mother's. She had taken every last cent. I sat there, staring at the evidence, my entire body trembling. Can I get this money back? My voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Caldwell adjusted his glasses. Legally? Yes. Your mother had no right to touch that money. It was protected under the trust. If we take this to court, she'll have no choice but to return it. I let out a shaky breath. And if she refuses? He gave me a pointed look. Then she'll face fraud charges. And so will her husband. Fraud. My mother and Ron had stolen from me. And now, they were going to pay. Margaret reached over, squeezing my hand. We're going to fix this, Emma. You're not alone anymore. For the first time in years, I believed her. I didn't go home that night. I didn't go back to the cafe, or to the diner, or to the endless cycle of exhaustion that had become my life. Instead, I prepared. By the time I stepped into that house, I was ready. Ron was on the couch, beer in hand, flipping through the channels like he had nothing better to do. My mother sat across from him, her nails freshly manicured, scrolling through her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. They didn't even look up when I walked in. Where have you been? My mother asked absent-mindedly. I set the folder down on the coffee table. She glanced at it, uninterested. What's this? Proof, I said. That got her attention. Ron sat up, his eyes narrowing. Proof of what? I met his gaze, unflinching. Proof that you stole my money. That you and my mother drained my trust fund. Spent $500,000 that didn't belong to you. Proof that you committed fraud. Silence. Then my mother laughed. She actually laughed. Oh, sweetheart, she said, shaking her head. You don't understand. We used that money to take care of you. Really? I shot back, my voice ice cold. Did taking care of me include your luxury vacations? Your gambling? The drugs? Her face paled. Ron stood up, his fists clenching. You don't know what you're talking about. I smiled. Oh, but I do. And so does my lawyer. And guess what? If that money isn't returned in full, you're both going to jail. Ron took a step toward me, but I didn't flinch. Careful, I warned, because if you touch me, I'll make sure the cops know about the other things you've been up to. His face turned red with rage, but he didn't move. My mother, on the other hand, looked like she was about to pass out. Emma, please, we can fix this. No, I cut her off. You can't. You made your choice. And now, you're going to face the consequences. She opened her mouth to argue. But before she could say another word, there was a knock at the door. Ron turned, confused. Who the hell? The moment he opened it, the color drained from his face. Two uniformed officers stood there, badges gleaming. Ronald Miller? One of them asked. He didn't even get a chance to answer before they stepped inside. Within minutes, both he and my mother were in handcuffs. I watched as they were led out of the house, screaming, begging, cursing my name, but I didn't feel sorry for them. Not one bit, because I had finally taken back what was mine. Do you think I deserve to get my money back? Comment 111 if you agree, or tell me what you would have done differently. I didn't go home that night, not in the way I used to. This time, I wasn't a prisoner returning to my cell. I wasn't a helpless girl forced to live under their rule. This time, I was walking into their house as the person they had tried to break and failed. By the time I stepped through the front door, I already knew exactly how this would go. My heart wasn't racing. My hands weren't shaking. I was done being afraid of them. Ron was in his usual spot on the couch, beer in hand, flipping through channels like he had nothing better to do. My mother sat beside him, her freshly manicured nails tapping mindlessly on her phone. They didn't even glance up when I walked in. Where is my money? Silence. Then my mother scoffed, barely looking up from her screen. Emma, not this again. Ron took a slow sip of his beer. Whatever you think you know, sweetheart, forget it. He leaned back, smirking. You've been living under our roof for years. If anything, you owe us. I smiled, not because I found anything amusing, but because I had been waiting for those exact words. I pulled out the folder from my bag and dropped it onto the coffee table with a satisfying thud. Actually, I said, tilting my head, you owe me. My mother frowned, finally setting her phone down. What is that? I crossed my arms. Evidence? Ron laughed. Evidence of what? That we fed you? Gave you a place to live? I didn't blink. Evidence that you stole $500,000 from me. Their reactions were instant. My mother's face paled, her mouth parting slightly. Ron's smirk faltered. I don't know what you're talking about, my mother said quickly. Don't you? I reached forward and flipped open the folder. Because according to these bank statements, my father set up a trust fund for me. And according to these withdrawal slips, I slid a sheet of paper across the table, tapping the signature at the bottom. You drained every last cent. My mother didn't say anything, but I could see the way her hands started to tremble. Ron, on the other hand, leaned forward, his expression turning dark. Listen here, you little... I cut him off with a single sentence. My grandmother's lawyer has copies of everything. The room went deathly silent. I had them. They knew it. Ron stood up, towering over me, his face red with anger. You think you could just walk in here and threaten us? He sneered. You don't have a case. That money was ours. We spent it taking care of you. I tilted my head unfazed. Did taking care of me include first-class vacations? Designer clothes? Gambling? I stepped forward, meeting his glare head-on. Or how about the drugs? My mother gasped. Emma! I turned on her. I know everything. I let the words sink in, watching as the color drained from her face. And so does the lawyer. And if that money isn't returned, you're both going to prison? You wouldn't dare, she whispered, voice shaking. I smiled. Try me? I watched as the realization set in. This was real. This wasn't one of their games, one of their manipulations. I wasn't some naive child they could gaslight into submission. And then, like flipping a switch, my mother's face changed. She reached for my hand, her eyes wide, pleading. Emma, sweetheart, please, we can fix this. We're family. I yanked my hand away. You stole my father's last gift to me. My voice was calm, but I could feel the anger burning just beneath the surface. And now, you're going to pay. Her lip quivered. I did it for you. I let out a bitter laugh. For me? You let me work myself into the ground while you spent my inheritance on vacations and drugs. I shook my head. You didn't do anything for me. You did it for yourself. Ron clenched his fists. You think you're so smart, don't you? He stepped forward, looming over me. You think you've won? I didn't flinch. I don't think I've won, I said, tilting my head. I know I have. And just then, a knock at the door. Ron's entire body stiffened. My mother sucked in a sharp breath. I turned to the door, taking my time as I pulled it open. And there they were, 2 uniformed police officers, standing tall, badges gleaming. Raul Miller? One of them asked. His face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. What the hell is this? You're under arrest for fraud, theft, and financial abuse, the officer continued. We have a warrant for your arrest. My mother let out a strangled gasp. No, wait, ma'am. The officer turned to her. You need to come with us too." She shook her head violently, stepping back. "No, no, no, this is a mistake." But it wasn't, because as they read them their rights, as they placed the cold steel cuffs around their wrists, I felt something I hadn't in years. Relief. Ron cursed, struggling against the officers, shouting threats that I barely heard. My mother sobbed, begging, swearing that she never meant to hurt me. But I didn't listen, because their words meant nothing. I had won. Ron and my mother were convicted of fraud and theft. The judge made sure they had to pay back every single dollar, what they hadn't already wasted at least. But money didn't matter to them anymore, because they were behind bars. And Tyler and Jake, without their parents' stolen fortune, their lives spiraled. They lost everything. Their fancy cars, their cushy lifestyle. Tyler got arrested for drug possession within months. Jake followed soon after. The perfect life they had built off of my suffering came crashing down around them. And me? I walked away. I took my rightful inheritance and built a life that was mine. A business, a future, something my father would have been proud of. Because in the end, karma always comes. And when it does, it doesn't hold back. Do you think they got what they deserve? Comment 111 if you agree, or tell me what you would have done differently. For years, they laughed at me. They mocked my exhaustion, my cheap clothes, the grease stains on my uniform. They saw me as nothing more than a servant, a burden, someone they could control. But now, I was free. Now, I was the one who had everything, and they were the ones with nothing. The first thing I did after reclaiming my inheritance was pack my bags and leave. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't even look back. With the money rightfully mine, I moved into my own apartment, small but mine. For the first time in years, I woke up in a place where I wasn't forced to clean up after people who despised me, where I didn't have to hand over every dollar I earned. And with that money, I did something they never thought I would. I built something. I had spent years working myself to the bone in restaurants, watching how businesses were run, learning what made them succeed and what made them fail. And now I had the chance to do it myself. So I did. I opened a small cafe, one that I owned. The same girl they had called Burger Girl was now the boss. And as my business grew, so did my confidence. I hired a team, expanded the menu, built a reputation. My cafe became a success, a place where people actually respected me. And the best part? I did it without them. While I was thriving, they were falling apart. After Ron and my mother were convicted of fraud, their entire world crumbled. The courts forced them to repay what they had stolen. But with no money left, their house was repossessed, their assets seized. The lavish lifestyle they had stolen from me? Gone. They went from first-class vacations to scraping by in a rundown apartment. From luxury cars to bus passes. From fine dining to food stamps. And as for Tyler and Jake, without their parents' money to support them, they spiraled. Fast. They had never known struggle before. They had never worked a day in their lives. They didn't know how to survive without someone handing them everything. So they turned to other ways to cope. Parties, drugs, arrests. Within a year, Tyler had been arrested for drug possession. Within 2 years, Jake followed, caught dealing to pay off his debts. Their perfect, privileged world had come crashing down just like that. I heard rumors. How my mother begged distant relatives for money. How Ron tried and failed to get a job. How Tyler and Jake had become nothing more than addicts, shadows of the arrogant boys they once were. And I didn't feel sorry for them. Not even a little. One day, long after I had moved on, my mother reached out to me. A letter delivered to my cafe, addressed in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the better of me. So I opened it. Emma, please. I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you, but I'm your mother. I have nowhere else to go. Please help me. I stared at the words, waiting for something, anger, sadness, regret. But all I felt was nothing, because she wasn't my mother. Not anymore. So I tossed the letter into the trash, walked back into my cafe, and got back to my life. They used to laugh at me for being a waitress. Now, I own my own business. And them? They'd be lucky to get a meal in prison. Do you think they got what they deserved? Comment 111 if you agree, or tell me what you would have done differently. I used to think that revenge was about making them suffer the way they made me suffer. I thought justice meant watching them lose everything, just like they had taken everything from me. And for a while I won. I got my money back, my freedom, and the satisfaction of watching their world crumble. But the truth? The best revenge wasn't seeing them punished. It was simply leaving them behind. I left Los Angeles soon after. The city held too many ghosts, too many memories of nights spent scrubbing dishes until my hands ached, of humiliation, of being treated like nothing. So I moved somewhere quieter, somewhere I could breathe, a place where no one knew my name, where I wasn't the girl whose mother stole her inheritance, where I wasn't the girl who had been forced to pay rent in her own home. For the first time in my life, I chose where I wanted to be, and it felt incredible. The only person I stayed in touch with was my grandmother. She was my real family, the one person who had always been on my side, who had fought for me when no one else had. We had Sunday dinners together, just the two of us, in a home filled with laughter instead of cruelty. She told me stories about my father, the man he was, the dreams he had for me, and I held on to those stories, letting them replace the pain of everything I had lost. Because that's the thing about moving on. You don't forget. You don't pretend the past didn't happen. You just stop letting it control you. I never checked up on my mother or Ron again. I didn't need to. I knew where they were, buried and dead, trapped in the mess they had created. Tyler and Jake had fallen so deep into their addictions that they were beyond saving. But I didn't care. They had become nothing more than a distant memory, just a chapter in a book I had long since finished reading. I didn't hate them, because hate takes energy, and I wasn't wasting another second of my life on them. I had better things to do. People ask me if I ever got closure, if I ever wished things had been different, and the truth is no. I wouldn't change a thing, because every betrayal, every hardship, every moment of pain had led me here, to a life that was mine, to a future where I was free. Sometimes the best revenge is simply walking away. Have you ever been betrayed like this? Share your story in the comments. Subscribe to AGS Stories for more stories of survival and karma.